The easel was already set up when I walked into the common room, and my breath caught before I understood why. There, tilted slightly against the light, was a charcoal sketch unmistakably of me. Shoulders bare, the back of my neck caught in that soft arch I only noticed in summer mirrors. His signature wasn't on the paper, but it didn't have to be. He was seated across the room, head down, pretending to fidget with another pad. But I knew, that line work, that obsession with detail, it was his. And it was me. Oh God. Outside, the cicadas droned loud and long through the olive trees, but inside the villa it was quieter than I could stand. My hand gripped the doorframe with more tension than I wanted to show. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was something more complicated than that. This was supposed to be a reset. Just 3 weeks in Italy, tucked into the edges of an artist residency that promised sunlight and privacy and discretion, a word they used more than once, as if they knew I needed to hear it. I had given them a different last name, something soft and anonymous, and they never asked questions. The coordinator smiled and handed me a key to a small yellow house tucked away from the main studio building, saying simply, "You'll be sharing with a young painter. Same region as you, so we thought it'd be a comfortable pairing." Comfortable, that was the exact word she used. When I arrived at the house with my luggage, he was already there, barefoot, sketching a lemon tree onto the back of a pizza box. His hair was longer than I remembered and lighter too, sun-bleached probably, and he barely looked up as I crossed the threshold with something dangerously close to disbelief creeping through my chest. There was a pause. Then he grinned, not sheepish, but amused. "They think I'm your nephew," he said, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. I should have asked to switch houses. I know that. I should have marched right back up the dirt path and insisted that they find someone else to live with me, preferably a woman in her 50s with a preference for silence and separate kitchens. But I didn't. Maybe because it was too late in the day, or maybe because a part of me liked that he was here, in this version of life where no one knew us, where we weren't anything except two strangers with shared bloodlines and separate stories. The first night passed with awkward politeness. I claimed the room with the balcony. He took the smaller one facing the orchard, and we cooked pasta together, mostly without speaking. I watched him more than I meant to. The deliberate way he stirred the sauce, the way his sleeves stayed rolled to the elbow like a painter even when he wasn't drawing anything. Was it always like that? Had I just stopped seeing it? This morning, I woke before the sun. The kitchen was cool, the tile sharp under my bare feet. I made espresso and stepped onto the balcony wrapped in a robe, letting the quiet settle into my skin. He was already outside, a sketchbook on his lap, cigarette tucked behind his ear, eyes turned toward the valley below. When he saw me, he nodded once and went back to whatever he was working on. It was only later, when I came into the shared room with a towel over my shoulder, hair still damp from the shower, that I saw it. The sketch. My outline. My shoulders. That quiet dip of my spine. And it was then I realized that I'd never seen myself drawn like that before. Not objectified, not idealized, just observed. It was intimate in a way that twisted something under my ribs. "You're drawing me now?" I asked. Too sharply, maybe, and he finally looked up. "It's not finished," he said, tapping his pencil against the page, but there was a smile hiding at the corners of his mouth. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." "I didn't agree to be a subject," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You didn't disagree either," he replied, not smug, just calm, like it was a fact of nature. "You stood on that balcony like you knew someone would be watching." My throat tightened. Was that true? Had I known? Had I wanted it? I couldn't find the words to challenge him, so instead I turned and left, the robe clinging to my back, my skin still damp, my chest tightening with something I couldn't name. I retreated into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. Not the figure in his sketch, but the real one. There were faint lines at the corners of my eyes, and a pink flush on my collarbone that wasn't from the sun. My heart was still racing. Back in the kitchen, he was washing brushes as if the moment hadn't happened. He offered me coffee like it was a normal morning. I took it because I didn't know what else to do. Later that afternoon, I walked past his room and paused when I noticed the door open. Inside, sketches were scattered everywhere. Notebooks, napkins, brown paper, scraps of canvas. Most of them were studies of hands, gestures, half-finished figures. But tucked between them were versions of me. Not all accurate, not all flattering, but all real. The shape of my wrists, the tension in my jaw, the way my hair curled at the ends when I didn't bother to straighten it. Why did it feel like he knew me better now than my husband had in the last 5 years? I stepped outside and tried to breathe in the dry air, the rosemary and stone and heat that pressed against my skin. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel violated. But instead, I felt seen. That was worse somehow. Dinner came and went. We grilled vegetables, drank cheap wine, sat on the porch in silence. When he finally looked at me and asked, "Would you pose for a formal study?" My chest fluttered, and I hated how quickly I answered. Yes, but only once, and nothing suggestive. He nodded, serious now. Of course, just one study. I knew that was a lie. Not that he meant to lie, but that's how it always begins. One exception, one moment of softness, one tilt of the head that lingers too long. I finished my wine in silence, feeling the weight of the night settle on my skin like the breeze off the hills. And as we cleared the table together, side by side, his elbow brushed against mine, barely a touch. But it sent a jolt through me I wasn't ready for. Not again. What was I even doing here? The smell of turpentine lingered from the night before, clinging to the curtains and seeping into the fibers of the rug. I found myself standing barefoot in the middle of the common room again, holding my coffee with both hands, as if the warmth could anchor me to something solid. The windows were open, and the morning light stretched across the table in long, clear beams that made everything fruit, notebooks, the crooked lamp in the corner seem more vivid than it should have. He was already outside, sketchpad on his knees, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of olive trees and rustling linen. I watched from the doorway without speaking, feeling like a guest in someone else's memory. He looked peaceful in that moment, and for a few seconds I imagined I could just be a passerby, someone seeing him for the first time, unburdened by context or history. I had agreed to pose. Not because I felt obligated, but because something in his voice made refusal seem irrelevant. Still, the idea sat heavily with me. After all these years of moving around my own body like it was someone else's, something useful, functional, exhausted, I was being asked to treat it as art. What did that even mean anymore? That morning, I put on a pale linen dress that fell to my ankles, sleeveless but modest, one I hadn't worn in years. It had hung in the back of my closet untouched, waiting for a version of me that still believed in the power of silhouettes. Now, as I stepped into the main studio space and saw him setting up his easel, I felt like I had stumbled into someone else's scene. "Is this okay?" I asked, not meaning the dress, not entirely. He looked up and gave a small nod. Perfect. He motioned to a chair by the window, positioned just enough in shadow to create a soft outline without washing me out. I sat, crossing my legs slowly, feeling the quiet hum of air against my arms. He adjusted the light without touching me, but I could feel his presence behind me, calculating angles, considering shadows. When he finally sat down, he didn't speak. The room thickened with silence. I stayed still, for longer than I thought I could. My shoulders began to ache from the tension of stillness, but I didn't shift. His eyes moved from canvas to me, his pencil moving steadily, then pausing, then gliding again. There was nothing suggestive about the way he looked, and that somehow made it worse. Or maybe better. I couldn't decide. I remembered a time years ago when I used to help him with his science projects at the kitchen table. Back then, his fingers were clumsy and full of hesitation, struggling to measure, to cut clean lines, to follow directions. Now they moved with confidence, with precision. When had that changed? At one point, he stood and approached me with a small gesture. I flinched before I realized what he was doing. He reached toward my hair, brushing one strand behind my shoulder without saying a word. His hand lingered near my collarbone for a second too long. Just 1 second. Then he stepped back and returned to his stool. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't anything, really. But I felt it for the rest of the day. By early evening, he was still drawing, and I was still sitting, trying not to let my thoughts drift into dangerous territory. The house was quiet except for the distant rustle of wind and the occasional scrape of pencil on paper. When he finally looked up and said, "That's it?" I exhaled without meaning to. I stood slowly, letting the stiffness unfold from my back. He turned the canvas so I could see, and I found myself staring at something almost unfamiliar. The woman on the paper looked strong, not in a bold or aggressive way, but with a kind of rooted elegance. There was nothing provocative about the sketch, but it still held a softness that felt deeply personal. "That's me?" I asked, half joking. He gave a brief nod, looking pleased but unreadable. "That's how I see you." The compliment settled somewhere just beneath my ribs. I offered a small smile and stepped away, needing the kitchen, the faucet, the clink of a glass to remind myself where I was and what boundaries still existed. We didn't talk much over dinner. I made couscous and grilled zucchini, and he set the table like we were ordinary people in an ordinary house. But the air between us had shifted. It wasn't tense, not exactly, but charged in a way that made every glance feel layered. I caught him looking at my hands when I passed the salt. He didn't look away. Later that night, I found myself staring at the ceiling in bed, unable to sleep. The quiet was too loud, my body too aware of itself. I didn't know what I was expecting. I didn't know what I was afraid of either. Maybe that was the real problem. Not knowing. At some point I got up, wandered barefoot into the shared space again. The studio door was cracked open, and I pushed it gently with my fingers. He was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook in his lap, scribbling quick lines by the dim light of a desk lamp. He looked up. "Can't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "You?" He tilted his head. "Not when my mind's this full." I wanted to ask full of what, but I didn't. I just leaned against the wall and watched him work. He didn't offer to show me what he was drawing this time, and I didn't ask. Something about the moment felt fragile, like sound could break it. When I finally turned to leave, I paused. "Would you ever do a series, not just one portrait, but something fuller?" He looked up, eyes sharp with interest. "I've thought about it. A study of emotion through posture, maybe. Something real." "You should," I said quietly. His reply was slower this time. "Only if you'd let me use you." The air seemed to pause. I met his gaze, then nodded once and left without another word. My heart was beating faster than it should have. Back in bed, the sheets felt cold against my legs. I closed my eyes and tried to push the memory down, but it stayed there, just beneath the surface. Could I really let this continue? The sound of the door swinging open wasn't loud, but in that moment it cut through the studio like a siren. I didn't turn my head right away. I was seated on the edge of the chaise in a soft blue wrap, my hands resting on my knees, chin tilted slightly down. His direction, his light, his words had placed me there. The pose wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, contained, honest. But when I finally lifted my gaze, I saw him. One of the other residents, a sculptor maybe late 20s, wiry build, sharp cheekbones, stood frozen in the doorway. His eyes flicked from the canvas to me, then back again, and something in his face shifted. Not confusion, not embarrassment. Something closer to amusement. "Oh, sorry," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't realize this space was in use." He stepped back and pulled the door shut before either of us could say anything. The click of the latch echoed. My heart was pounding, but not from the interruption. It was the way the silence rushed back in afterward. He stood across from me still, brush in hand, expression unreadable. Neither of us moved. That was the first moment I realized we were no longer invisible here. Later, while rinsing our mugs after lunch, I heard whispers from the terrace, the kind too deliberate to be coincidence. A quiet chuckle, followed by the word intimate. I didn't look, didn't ask, but I knew. It had begun. What was I thinking agreeing to pose again? He didn't bring it up. Not that afternoon, not that evening. Instead, he acted like nothing had shifted. He kept sketching between meals, rearranged canvases in the corner room, adjusted lighting setups like a professional preparing for a gallery. But I noticed the way his eyes lingered longer, the way his sleeves stayed rolled even in the evening breeze, the way his compliments stopped being technical and started sounding more like observations. "You hold tension in your shoulders," he said once, watching me cut vegetables. "But it suits you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We walked together through the old garden later that night. The pathways curved around overgrown lavender and little stone benches warmed from the sun. Our footsteps were soft in the dust. He was talking about line weight and gesture drawings, the kinds of things I used to hear in background conversations when he was a teenager, nose buried in sketchbooks at the kitchen table. But there was a different tone now, steady, measured, and low. At one point, I stopped walking. The breeze tugged lightly at my skirt, and I let the silence stretch between us. He turned to face me, hands loosely in his pockets. "I'm not just drawing you," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "You know that, don't you?" I held his gaze. My skin prickled even though the air was still warm. There were no sounds but cicadas and the distant murmur of wine glasses from the other villa. "I do now," I said. He stepped closer, just one pace. Not enough to be inappropriate, not enough to break anything, but enough to confirm everything unspoken. His fingers brushed against mine and I didn't move. His eyes searched mine and I felt the space between us collapse in on itself. When he kissed me, it wasn't rushed. It was careful. Like he knew this was a door that wouldn't shut again once opened. Afterward, I stood still long after he stepped away. My heart was beating too hard, and I didn't trust my own voice to speak. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the knowledge that something irreversible had just taken root inside us. Later, in the kitchen, the lights dimmed. I could still feel the press of his palm against my hand from earlier. He moved behind me to get a glass from the cabinet, his voice near my shoulder. "We don't have to talk about it." "But we will," I said, barely above a whisper. The next morning, something had shifted in me. My body felt lighter, but not freer, more exposed somehow. I caught myself looking in the mirror longer, adjusting the way my dress cinched at the waist, considering details I hadn't thought about in years. He was outside sketching under the pergola, but I didn't go to him. I needed a moment to remember who I was outside of his canvas. At lunch, two of the younger artists, a photographer and a writer, asked if I'd like to join their group dinner next week. They spoke kindly but glanced toward me with curiosity, as though trying to decode something they couldn't quite say. I smiled and nodded, agreeing without listening. It didn't matter. That evening, he came to me with another sketch pad, this one heavier, and sat on the floor beside the couch while I read. He didn't speak at first, just drew. The sound of pencil on paper created a soft rhythm in the room. I felt oddly calm. "What are you working on now?" I finally asked, my voice low. He turned the pad toward me. It wasn't a portrait. It was a series of gestures. Just hands, shoulders, silhouettes in tension. All mine, but somehow unfamiliar. "I've been studying movement," he said. "The way you hold space." The honesty in his words startled me more than anything. There was no flirtation there, just admiration. As I reached for the pad to look closer, his hand brushed mine again. I paused. looked up. His eyes held something steady this time, something quietly certain. Why does it scare me more when someone sees me clearly than when they touch me? That night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my own reflection and noticed something I hadn't seen in years: a quiet intensity behind the eyes. I turned off the light and stood there for a long time, breathing into the stillness, trying to make sense of what was happening between us and what it meant to lose balance in a place that was supposed to offer refuge. I didn't sleep well. Not because of guilt, because of something closer to anticipation. Or was it fear? When I woke the next morning and walked into the shared kitchen, a single lemon sat on the counter beside a folded sheet of paper. I opened it. A pencil sketch. Just my hand, curled softly around the edge of a chair, drawn in exquisite detail. No words, but I knew exactly who it was for. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the walls inside the villa had already absorbed too much heat. I stood near the open kitchen window, trying to ignore how still the air had become. The herbs in the windowsill wilted visibly between morning and midday, and for a moment I had the absurd impulse to ask if we could move the basil indoors, as if that would fix anything. He was gone most of the day, not far, just up the path at the main studio where the other residents shared work and critiques. But his absence was louder than I expected. I kept finding pieces of him in the silence: a folded cloth on the counter, a pencil wedged between books, the faint trail of paint under his fingernails on the bathroom towel. I didn't touch any of it. I spent the morning rearranging shelves that didn't need rearranging and reading paragraphs I couldn't remember. I kept trying to find my rhythm again, the one I had before we crossed whatever line it was we'd crossed. But nothing moved the same now. Just before noon, I stepped outside with a glass of cold water, searching for air that felt less heavy. The courtyard shimmered with light, the stone too bright to look at directly. I sat in the shade, the cup sweating in my hand, and stared at the sky for longer than I meant to. A single bird cut across it with sudden speed and vanished. That was when I saw the notification. My phone, which I had left on silent for days, buzzed with a message that appeared without context, but with a timestamp I couldn't ignore. Hope the workshops aren't too inspiring. Thinking of dropping by. My husband. The words sat flat on the screen, but I could still feel the shape of them in my throat. I read the message 3 times before locking the screen again. There was no warmth in his tone, no punctuation either. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't say when. He just planted the idea like a seed and waited for it to grow into worry. I didn't respond. Instead, I went back inside and stood barefoot in the studio, trying to breathe through the weight building in my chest. The easel was still set up from the day before, angled toward the window where the light had shifted slightly, casting long shadows across the floor. The canvas on it was blank, just stretched linen waiting for a mark. I considered lifting a pencil. I didn't. When he returned, later than usual, there was something softer in his step. He carried 2 small paper bags and a thin roll of new brushes tied with string. He didn't ask where I'd been, or why my jaw was set tighter than normal. He just placed the food on the table and said, "Let's eat outside." I followed him to the garden without speaking. The breeze had returned, a gentle one, almost apologetic. We sat on the same stone bench we had the first week. He handed me half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and I unwrapped it slowly, focusing on the sound instead of the tension in my chest. He began telling me about the group critique, how someone's painting fell off the easel, how another had an argument over color theory. His voice carried the ease of distance. He didn't notice the way I kept glancing at my phone. Or maybe he did, and chose not to ask. Eventually, I broke the silence. "He might be coming," I said. He paused mid-sentence. "Who?" I didn't need to say it. He knew. He nodded once, looked down at his food, then out toward the trees. "Do you want him to?" The question hung there between us, not cruel, not even curious, just steady. I didn't answer. Not right away. Because I didn't know. Or maybe I did, but didn't want to say it out loud. Later, I walked down into town alone. The path curved gently through lemon trees and over a narrow stone bridge that always made me slow down. I wandered through shops without meaning to buy anything, just letting myself be surrounded by the murmur of voices that didn't belong to me. At one corner cafe, I paused at a newsstand. A local art magazine was on display. The cover featured a woman draped in muted fabric, her posture strikingly familiar. My stomach flipped before I realized it wasn't me. But it could have been. I returned home just before dusk. The windows of the villa were golden with lamplight, and for a moment it looked like something from a postcard, warm and simple and safe. But I knew better than to trust the stillness. He was in the studio again, sketching with a quiet focus that made me stop in the doorway and watch without interrupting. There was something comforting about the way he worked. Like every line he drew gave shape to something unspoken. I wondered if that's why I had let it happen, let it go so far. Because he saw things I didn't know were still visible. "I might not be here next week," I said eventually. He didn't look up. "I know." That was all we said. That night, I made dinner while he sat on the porch. The roles reversed. Me moving through the kitchen, him quiet and still. There was a part of me that wanted him to stop me, to ask what I needed, to give some answer I couldn't name. But he didn't. When we ate, the plates between us felt like distance markers. I went to bed early, unable to pretend I wasn't unraveling. As I lay there, the ceiling fan clicking overhead, I kept hearing his question again. "Do you want him to come?" I turned it over in my mind until it lost meaning. The next morning brought cooler air. A shift. The light fell in longer strips across the tile. I boiled water for tea and stood by the counter with bare feet pressing into the stone, hoping for stillness that wouldn't come. There was a knock on the door. Not loud, not rushed, just inevitable. The room was too quiet, and for the first time since I arrived, I wished it were louder. I stood near the doorway of the temporary gallery they'd set up in the old wine storage building. All raw brick and creaking floors, sunlight filtering through mismatched window panes. People moved in small, polite groups, sipping from plastic cups of sparkling wine and murmuring in that deliberate, performative hush that only art events create. My throat was dry. My palms, cold. I hadn't expected him to go through with it. He'd arrived the day before, suitcase in one hand, sunglasses still on despite the hour. I heard the car pull up and waited by the window instead of greeting him. When he stepped inside, he scanned the space like a landlord inspecting a rental, as if his presence was supposed to settle everything back into its proper shape. "Quiet here," he'd said, tossing his keys on the counter like it still belonged to him. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. We didn't speak of the exhibit at dinner or of anything important. He hadn't mentioned the residency or the sketches or what he might have seen online, only asked if the food was local and if I was sleeping well. When I excused myself early and went to bed, I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when or how. But now I was in the middle of it. On the wall across from me hung a large charcoal study, the one he'd done in silence that second morning after I had agreed to pose. My shoulders bare, my expression soft but unreadable, the angle of my neck unmistakable, and underneath it, for the first time, a full name. My real name. Not the one I gave the residency. Not the one I used here. The one I'd put away on purpose. I turned my head slowly, afraid of how many more were hanging. They were all here. A series of 6. Some sketches, some pastels, 2 fully painted. The light study on my wrist. The seated profile in the linen dress. The arm draped over the chair back. Each image was intimate but restrained. Tasteful even. But the way they were displayed, together, labeled, titled as a series, created a new story. Muse of Midsummer, the sign read, an exploration of intimacy and distance. Underneath, a line in small print, presented by her husband. The sound that came out of me was too quiet to qualify as a gasp, but I felt it catch in my throat all the same. Around me, people studied the work with curiosity and admiration, unaware of the dissonance pressing against my chest. A woman near the back tilted her head, murmuring something about elegance and restraint. Another commented on the raw vulnerability of the subjects. No one asked why the woman in all the paintings looked nearly identical. No one had to. He stood by the makeshift bar, holding a drink, chatting with one of the coordinators like he belonged there. Like this had all been his idea. I didn't move toward him. I couldn't. Instead, I walked closer to the wall, close enough to see the faint fingerprints left in the smudges of the charcoal, the small tear in the paper where he had erased too hard. These were real. They were not imagined. They were never meant to be shared. He had taken something private and shaped it into a public artifact. It didn't matter that the images weren't graphic. It didn't matter that the guests found them tasteful. He had pulled me into the open, deliberately, methodically, and without asking. And worst of all, he had done it quietly. My son stood a few feet away near the far window. He hadn't said anything since we arrived. He hadn't touched the wine. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and his face was unreadable. Not embarrassed, not angry. Just still. I caught his eye. For a brief moment, the space between us vanished. He stepped toward me slowly. "I didn't know," he said under his breath, barely audible. Not until I walked in. My voice didn't come right away. When it did, it surprised me. "He knew everything," I said, "and he planned it." There was no fight, no shouting, no confrontation. The cruelty didn't need to raise its voice. The guests continued milling, drinking, complimenting. Some looked at me, now recognizing the subject of the work. A few smiled, as if I should be flattered. One man nodded slowly and said, "You must feel so seen." Seen? What does it mean to be seen if you're not given the choice? After a while, I stepped outside. The stone courtyard was cool and quiet in the shade. I leaned against the wall and let the heat drain out of my shoulders. I heard the gallery door open and shut behind me, but I didn't turn around. He stood near the steps, not quite beside me, drink still in hand. "I didn't think you'd mind," he said casually, almost bored. "They're good, you know, people like them." I stared ahead. "You put my name on them." "I wanted you to get credit," he said with a smile I couldn't bring myself to meet. "Besides, it's honest." That word, honest, pressed against my ribs like a bruise. Honesty without permission isn't honesty. It's exposure. I didn't speak. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Eventually, he walked back inside. When I returned later, most of the guests had moved on to the terrace for drinks and music. The room felt lighter, emptier. But the drawings were still there. Bold, present, irreversible. He had framed me. Not just on the wall, in everyone's minds. And in that moment, I knew something had ended. Not loudly, not even publicly, but completely. The villa was quiet again. Not the comforting quiet of arrival or the charged quiet of waiting, but a flat, sterile quiet that pressed against my skin like cold stone. The kind that lingers after something has been emptied out. He left early the next morning. No announcement. No suitcase packed in my presence. I only heard the front door click shut while I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair. By the time I came downstairs, the car was gone. The espresso machine was off. The chair he usually sat in, empty, like the rest of the day. No note, no final word, only absence. I walked through the studio slowly, letting my fingers trail the edge of the drafting table. The dried brushes still propped in the jar, the thin streaks of pigment on the cloth that covered the bench. There was no new sketch on the easel, only the impression left in the canvas where a hand had pressed too hard, then hesitated. He hadn't said much after the exhibition. A few brief sentences, a half-hearted apology that never really formed, followed by a long silence as we walked back to the house. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they already expect to lose. Gently, but without effort. I think that hurt more than the rest. I didn't cry. Not then. Not later. I just moved slowly through the space, putting things back where they didn't quite belong, hoping the ritual might fill the silence. The residency still had 3 days left. I considered leaving early, booking a train north, maybe slipping into a nameless hotel near Florence for a week. But something stopped me. Not responsibility, not pride. Something else. Something stubborn. Maybe I didn't want to vanish on his terms. That afternoon, one of the residency coordinators dropped by. She brought a package, thin, brown wrapped, with my real name printed neatly on the front. I thanked her with a practiced smile and carried it inside. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what was inside. When I did, hours later, I found all 6 prints carefully rewrapped, framed, cataloged. A small card on top read, "For your records." They were well received. I sat with the package beside me on the floor for nearly an hour before finally tucking it behind the armoire. I didn't destroy it. I didn't hang it. I just removed it from view, which felt like the most honest choice I had left. In the final 2 days, I made no new work. I sat by the window with tea, walked barefoot across the stone paths when the sun dipped low, listened to cicadas buzzing without rhythm. I didn't attend the group dinner on the last night. I heard the laughter from my room, and it sounded too far away to reach. On the final morning, I left a note on the kitchen counter for the next guest. A simple list of what works and what doesn't. The fan in the bedroom clicks. The third tile in the shower floor is loose. The sun hits the breakfast table best around 8. No signature. I took only what I came with. No canvases, no sketches. Just a folded linen dress and a single pencil, still sharp. The airport was uneventful. The gate quiet. I sat between strangers and scrolled through my phone without reading. Somewhere along the way, I found the exhibition online. A blog had posted photos, wide shots of the space, angled views of the drawings, a brief paragraph describing the show as quietly provocative, and a restrained exploration of feminine complexity. The comment section was full of strangers. One wrote, "She looks so composed, so confident." Another, "I love how the artist captured her stillness. There's power in restraint." And finally, "I wonder who she was. There's something honest about her." I turned off the screen. Was that honesty ever mine to choose? Weeks passed, then months. I returned home, but not to the same rhythm. The furniture sat differently. The kitchen light felt brighter than I remembered. I worked part-time assisting a ceramicist downtown, someone who didn't ask questions and offered tea instead of conversation. The silence was easier there. It didn't pretend to be anything else. He sent a message once, the young one. Not long. Just a single line. "I'm painting again. Thank you." I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting it. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. One morning, I stood at the window and looked out at the backyard. The light came in the same as always, but my shadow had changed. There was a heaviness in my chest. Not grief exactly, but the echo of something that had already passed. I went into the spare room and found the package again. It hadn't shifted. Hadn't aged. I opened it carefully and laid each piece on the floor, side by side, like puzzle tiles arranged for no one. They didn't feel like betrayals anymore. They felt like memories, imperfect, incomplete, and stubbornly still beautiful. I picked one up, the soft pencil rendering of my hand curled against fabric, and traced the outline gently with my thumb. It didn't look like a woman who had been caught or framed or exposed. It looked like someone who had paused. That's all. And maybe that was enough.